BookTube, it's Roz, and this October 2023, two of the themes that we've been kind of thinking about are the position of women and the impact on class in Victorian society. We've also had a bit of a side interest on newcomers, strangers and outsiders, and I want to talk about two books that I've read for this October: Thomas Hardy's The Woodlanders and Elizabeth Gaskell's Cousin Phillis, two books that are new to me but by favourite authors of mine, which are interesting around educating women and the impact that having a certain sort of level of education has on an individual woman, and this sort of interaction with her birth class, you know, the sort of class that her family comes from, and her and those that she meets. So both, I have to say, wonderful books that I'm really happy that I've read. So, you know, expect a little bit of enthusing here and there in this video. Now, Victorian society might sometimes seem to us quite static, but it was anything but. And I think if you read Victorian literature, you soon come to realise that. So, you know, there were enormous forces of change going on in Victorian Britain. Around industrialisation, economic change, changes in transport, changes in the extent to which people moved around. And although class was really significant, it wasn't kind of really tightly fixed. You know, people were making money and moving up. Trying to work out, you know, if someone made money through trade or had a profession that was linked to industry, you know, where did that put them in the sort of traditional class picture? You know, how does this all fit together? And that's, you know, very much reflected in these two books. And in particular, there's a sort of a feeling of how changes bring new people into an area and the effect that can have in sort of shaking up traditional relationships. So, Cousin Phillis is a novella, about 150 odd pages, quite a quick read and a joyous read. Well, joyous as in for reading pleasure, not necessarily a happy story. Well, I shall avoid spoilers in this book as far as possible in this video. This was one that Gaskell published in 1864. It's a key element of change in this book is the coming of the railway and building of a railway across a sort of rural area, and, you know, the way that might shake things up and, as I say, bring new people into this area. Now, Phillis herself, it also, I think, and this is true of both books address that issue of proximity in relationships. So, you know, in a society where people move around more, there's more chance for, you know, people not to just marry people that they already know, fall in love with people that they already know that are local, that through established relationships. You know, there's this feeling of things being shaken up, as I say. Now, and also both books, I think, really address some of the finer gradations of class that you found in Victorian times. Cousin Phillis, she's the daughter of a farmer, and a farmer who was also a dissenting minister. So, you know, not Church of England, but, you know, the free churches that had grown up in the 18th and 19th century. And so he's not the sort of well-off gentleman farmer with large land holdings. You know, he's someone who works the land himself, but is a very important figure in his village, employs a lot of other people to work on his land with him. And but he's also someone who's chosen to study, and he encourages his daughter Phillis to study, and he teaches her Latin and Greek, so she's comes from this sort of rural agricultural sort of barely middle class background, but she has an education that is one step up from that. The newcomers that come into this story are her cousin Paul Manning. Now Paul is interesting because he's the son of a mechanic, someone who works in industry with his hands, but is a smart man who is a bit of a self-taught engineer and inventor, and Paul gets enough in education to take a job as a clerk to a man working for a railway company, for a clerk to the managing engineer for this new railway that's being built, and that brings him to a rural area where one of his mother's cousins lives, and so he's sort of like a second cousin to cousin Phillis, and so that's how he comes into her life. But following on from him, so he's kind of like poorer than cousin Phillis's family, and slightly closer to the working class, but so maybe not quite her equal, but possibly could be. But she's definitely educated. He can read and write and do maths and so on. He can act as a clerk to an engineer, but he doesn't know Latin and Greek and so on. So these little gradations. But following from him, his manager, the managing engineer, Mr. Holsworth, comes and also meets cousin Phillis. And Mr. Holsworth is a sort of from the established middle class professional. He's well educated, he's well travelled. Yes, he knows Italian and Latin and Greek and so on. And he encounters Phillis, who is on one level an innocent country girl, and as I say, daughter of a farmer who's not a well-off farmer, and not in the local sort of landed society at all, but is educated, and there's a point of connection there for Phillis and Mr. Holsworth, and that's the crux of this story, as it were. In The Woodlanders, we have Grace Melbury. Now, Grace's father is a timber merchant. Now, his family have been in this area for many, many years, but he's like a well-off tradesman. He's quite wealthy. He owns his own sort of home, and it's a substantial one. But he's not. He's barely scraping at the bottom of the middle class in the same way as sort of Phillis's father would have been. But he's well enough off to send Grace to a sort of boarding school for middle-class young women. So, and she gets an education that puts her in a kind of uneasy place between her father, who's sort of wealthy but definitely, not, a gentleman, and her education, which is that of a gentleman's daughter. The two men in her life, one is not an outsider, one is Giles Winterbourne, who's kind of one step down from her and is a woodsman and like a skilled craftsman and a bit of a small he a small businessman. He's like a self-employed person, and he gets sort of contracts to make wood things, and do cider pressing, and but he's not educated, and he was her childhood sweetheart. They sort of were expected to marry, but as Grace's father, Mr. Melbury, says, there's a question that is Giles too poor to marry her, and his wife says, love will make up for his want of money. He adores the very ground she walks on. Yes, said the timber merchant, I know that well. There will be no lack of that with him. But since I've educated her so well and so long and so far above the level of the daughters hereabouts, it is wasting her to give her to a man of no higher standing than he. So he realises that he's perhaps educated her beyond her Giles, her childhood sweetheart. The newcomer in this story is Dr. Fitzpiers, and Dr. Fitzpiers is, like Mr. Holdsworth, a educated professional man, from sort of a good family, had good education, and full of new ideas too, that feeling of bringing change into a settled community. He does sort of studies things, and the villagers, in the woods are a bit concerned that it might be a bit, is it a bit devilish, some of the things he studies, diabolical, because it's new and different. Actually, he's studying, astronomy and chemistry and, physiology and so on. So and again, it's the proximity thing. Here he is in a quiet rural area and meets this young woman who is beautiful and who is educated to a level where they can, meet as equals, but socially she isn't really his equal. So both Grace and Phillis are sort of men are attracted to them who are a cut above them in Victorian social class terms because they are more educated. Does that result in happy results? Well, you'll have to read the books to find out. But it's certainly, and both girls have a degree of sort of confusion in their situation, I suppose, more particularly Grace Melbury. Phillis is more just like kind of pure-hearted innocent, I guess. So I've talked about these as if these are books predominantly of ideas, but actually there are two things that really make these really, really lovely novels. One is the emotional landscape of both books is really rich and lovely. They're psychologically interesting. They have characters that you really, engage with, and stories, romantic entanglements that, pull you in and will give you satisfaction as a reader. The second reason that both are lovely, lovely, lovely books is the way they describe a rural community. In Cousin Phillis, it's the world of farming. We get haymaking, we get apple picking, we get it's almost like a rural idyll, which we know the railway is going to change. But it also, being Elizabeth Gaskell, she also conveys some of the excitement and vigour of that change. The thrill of creating a railway across, untouched land, or the excitement of Paul's father inventing, better ways, better machines, better ways of doing things. She appreciates that as well. Lovely. But the one that absolutely kind of, brought me just layers and layers of joy was the way Hardy describes the woodlands in The Woodlanders. We get the seasons, how they change the woods, the different areas of wood and the different feelings, the animals, the birds, the sounds, the flowers, the trees themselves, and being Hardy, the wonderful detail of rural crafts, how you do them. It's like, he stood and watched, and he actually grew up in a cottage sort of in the woods, and this is something that is dear to his heart, and he really understands about how you make special shaped bits of wood that thatchers will use to hold thatch on roofs, or how you make hurdles from coppiced hazel, or how you strip bark from oaks to all that. I just love. I lap that up. So, two gorgeous books that met several of our Victober prompts, but also gave me the most amazing reading pleasure. If you've read either of them, do talk about it. Or if there are other books that you think are interesting in those sort of looking at those finer gradations of class and how education can slightly sort of confuse them. There you go.